Welcome, ladies and gents. Chris Andre here. Let's talk boxing. Let's get into some comments made by the great Antonio Tarver revolving around the heavyweight division. He said if Tyson Fury beats Alexander Usyk, he's got no reason to fight Anthony Joshua. There's just no need. And there was a guy there that was arguing with him and basically saying to him, look, at the end of the day, you beat Roy Jones Jr. Roy Jones Jr. beat Bernard Hopkins and Bernard Hopkins beat you. Doesn't that disprove the triangle theory? And Antonio Tarver was talking along the lines of timing, when the fights happened and so on and so forth. So he seems to be making a case for levels. Now, if this is his genuine position, there's no need for us to go over this time and time again. I've said it on this channel many, many times. Styles make fights. Triangle theories don't apply in boxing. The history of the sport has taught us that. I'm not going to keep going over it. But there's also many people out there that think that Antonio Tarver wasn't just talking about a triangle theory. He's actually talking about status. And the debates that have been raging on my Twitter timeline do seem to revolve around this concept. In other words, there are people out there that are saying for Tyson Fury to truly be the king of this era, the best of this era, for him to go down as an all-time great, a Hall of Famer, he has to also conquer the likes of Anthony Joshua and quote unquote, clean out the division of all the top contenders. So what I'm going to do is play the defense and the prosecution. Judge Chris Andre is going to be presiding once again. I'm going to explain to you exactly why, from a sporting perspective, what is being said here by Antonio Tarver, if he's talking about status, is actually fair. But I'm also going to explain why I personally do not agree with him. I'm going to present an argument to contrast the position that Tyson Fury does not need to fight Anthony Joshua. So let's get started. First and foremost, let's make a case for the position of the Magic Man, Antonio Tarver. If you look at some of the great heavyweights of the past, they didn't necessarily conquer the division by fighting all of the contenders either. Take a look at Lennox Lewis, for instance, one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, quite possibly the best heavyweight of all time. He's in that conversation. I've been saying this for years. Tunde Ajayi, the trainer of Anthony Yarde, believes he is the best heavyweight of all time. If you look at this little list of Ring Magazine's annual ratings of the heavyweights in the 1990s, you'll see the top 10 guys through the course of that decade. Now, the reason I've started at 1993, and I will go on to the 2000s in the following page, is because we're looking at the time that Lennox Lewis first won a world title and looking at all the contenders that he could have fought, and those he did fight and those he did not fight. Now, the reason we're using rings ratings is because there are so many governing bodies that have different ideas about who the top 10 is. I've done a video in the past where there were 22 heavyweights that could claim to be a top 10 fighter based on the different governing bodies. So really, if you look at Rings Magazine's annual rankings, you'll tend to see a fairer analysis of who the top guys generally are based on status and CV and so on and so forth. If you look at the ones that I've highlighted in yellow, they're the contenders that Lennox Lewis never fought before or after. The ones with a red star next to them, they're guys that had previously or currently had a version of the world title. There are also guys there like Oleg Maskaev who would go on to win a heavyweight title. He doesn't have a star next to his name. Perhaps it should also be noted that at the end of 1994, Lennox Lewis lost his title to Oliver McCall. He did not regain it until the start of 1997 in the rematch. So between 95 and 96, he was a top contender, but not a champion. As you can see there, he was ranked at number 2 in both years by Ring Magazine. And maybe you can make the case, therefore, that he's not obligated to fight top contenders when he's not himself a champion. In that period, he did fight Ray Mercer, though, who was a fellow top contender, ranked number 6 in 1996, and he won that fight by majority decision. Now, some of these people are guys that you can't really hold it against him for not fighting. Guys like Riddick Bowe, he tried to make that fight. It's not his fault it didn't come to fruition. Also guys there like Ike Abiyabuchi, top level contender. He would go on to go to prison, go and read about his life. But for a 3-year period, he was in that top 10 too. He was a problem. He was being spoken about as a future heavyweight champion. So there would have been an opportunity there to fight him. Then there are also guys like Michael Moorer. Throughout a number of years, throughout a 6-year period, he was a top 5 guy. He was a world champion. That fight never took place. You can also see guys like George Foreman, Larry Holmes, Tim Witherspoon. And if you look into the 2000s, you can see Vladimir Klitschko is there. And Vladimir Klitschko, for that 3-year period, there was a lot of talk about these two fighting. And he did go on to fight his brother Vitaly, but at the time, Vladimir was the one that was more highly rated. He was the one that was the Olympic gold medalist. He was the one that they were building up to be the new superstar of the heavyweight division. That fight never took place. And they were being strongly linked to fight with each other to such an extent that when a Hollywood movie came out, it was based in a casino, the heavyweight fight on display was actually Lennox Lewis versus Vladimir Klitschko, and they shaped up to face each other in the ring in this particular movie. And then there was a power cut and the lights went out, and we never got to see that fight in the movie. And unfortunately, we never got to see the fight in real life. You've also got guys like Chris Bird there, former world champion, who'd been as high as number 2 in the world, anywhere between 10 and 2 for a period of time. Point is, these are significant fighters and significant names that Lennox Lewis did not fight. But you would never claim that Lewis wasn't the king of that era, because he beat so many of the top dogs. And the same could be said for Tyson Fury. To go and take the belts off of Vladimir Klitschko and then relinquish them, he went off the rails, we all know about that story, to come back 3 years later to take the WBC belt off of Deontay Wilder, then to go and take them off of Alexander Usyk. Those are significant names. These are significant champions. This is not a case of Buster Douglas beating Mike Tyson and then you go and knock off a perceived weaker champion in Buster Douglas and you claim the credit for being undisputed and then you sail off into the sunset. He would have fought top level guys. And in terms of the likes of Dillian Whyte as well, he was never a world champion. But as contenders go, when you look at that CV, it's one of the strongest of all the heavyweights in today's era. So nobody would be able to say that Tyson Fury was illegitimate. He would have been a legitimate top guy on 2 separate occasions. One, where he's the undisputed champion, in other words, the top dog beyond dispute. And the other time when he'd beaten Klitschko, yeah, sure, there was one outstanding WBC belt to collect, but everybody knew that Vladimir Klitschko was the man. You can't take that away from Fury, and he would not have to beat Anthony Joshua to prove that. In fact, let me use another analogy to further make this point. Let's talk about football. In Euro 2020, which actually took place in the summer of 2021, the Italians conquered Europe. Italy were the best team in Europe. They played against England in the final, who were one of the favourites at Wembley, and still managed to overcome and lift the European trophy, and were considered one of the favourites to win the World Cup, which would take place the following year. However, tragedy struck them. They were beaten in the playoff round of the qualifiers by a minnow team, Fyrom, in March 2022. So less than a year later, they had failed to qualify for the World Cup. As the World Cup then took place and progressed, the Argentinians beat the French in the final. Now, the Argentinians were the South American kings, and they had conquered the French. The Italians can turn around and say, but we were the kings of Europe. You didn't really beat the best European team. You beat France, who are good, but not quite what we are. Now, that might be your position in the sense that you might think Italy, had they not been shocked, would have gone there and beaten the Argentines in the final and become World Cup winners. That doesn't make Argentina illegitimate champions, though. They are still the best team in the world. It's not their fault that Italy slipped up. Officially speaking, they are the world champions. If, subjectively speaking, you feel that Italy could have beaten them, that's a whole other argument. By the same token, if you believe that Anthony Joshua is better than Tyson Fury and would beat Tyson Fury, that's a subjective opinion and there's nothing wrong with that. No problem whatsoever, in the same way that I've got no problem if you think Italy were actually better than Argentina. You could make a very well thought out, fair, technical and tactical argument for both of those claims. But it does not deduct from the fact that Argentina became the world champions, and it does not deduct from the fact that Tyson Fury in history would have gone down as the number 1 guy. Fury could turn around and say, it's not my fault AJ lost to Usyk. I gave him the opportunity for a fight this summer. They lied and said that they had already signed to fight Dillian Whyte. Dillian Whyte then came out and rubbished that. Eddie Hearn admitted that the fight was unlikely. When they finally went back and agreed terms, you then saw Dillian Whyte fail a drugs test. That fight never happened. He went on to fight Robert Helenius. All of that could have been avoided if he'd accepted the terms that were given in December. We could have fought in the summer. And the counter argument that he didn't have a trainer, that's got nothing to do with me. It's not my fault that he keeps changing trainers. He can't settle with anyone because he keeps blaming the trainers. The fact of the matter is he didn't want to fight me. And what can you possibly argue in return to that? Now remember, my personal position has always been that if you're going to see 2 top class fighters face each other, like Fury, like AJ, in my opinion, they're both elite. I want them to both be at their best, feel healthy, and feel ready. So I don't hold it against Anthony Joshua. And there were many occasions previously to this summer where it was clear that AJ wanted to make the fight. So I'm not critical of AJ. We're just talking about the narrative that could emerge from Tyson Fury when he says, look, I proved I'm number 1 and nobody can accuse me of not wanting the fight with Anthony Joshua. However, now comes the counter argument, a contrasting case to the position of the Magic Man Antonio Tarver. We've spoken about Lennox Lewis. Let's talk about the greatest, Muhammad Ali, the guy you need to strive towards. The fact of the matter is, Muhammad Ali is always going to be known as the greatest. His status in that regard is secure. He meant far too much to far too many people for anybody ever to be able to overcome that. This is a guy who was heroic in the ring, but also he was a figure that extended beyond just boxing. A prominent civil rights figure, a man who was a hero to many pacifists and those that were anti-war, as well as the fact that he's Muslim, so he resonates with a lot of people of the Islamic faith around the world. The fact is, Muhammad Ali transcends the sport of boxing. He also, on top of those things, achieved incredible things in the ring. But despite those incredible in-ring achievements, he too was unable to fight every single contender in his day. But there is a caveat to this, and we'll be able to analyze it in a moment and explain exactly why Anthony Joshua should be an opponent for Tyson Fury. But in order to be fair and thorough, first we have to acknowledge the fact that Muhammad Ali was also unable to fight all of the world-class fighters in his day. Take a little look here at the list of fighters that were in the top 10 when Muhammad Ali was a world champion during the period of the 1960s. And I end it at 1967, and we'll pick it up on the next page at 1970 because of that 3-year hiatus. If you look at the 1970s and 60s, you'll see yellow lines there because there are certain top guys that he did not fight. But one thing's conspicuous here, isn't it? And that is that there are no red stars. You know, the ones that I was showing you were former champions in the Lennox Lewis list? Muhammad Ali fought those guys. He fought the Pattersons of the world. He fought George Foreman, Joe Frazier's, the guys that he had to overthrow that also were considered by most people to be kings. And Tyson Fury hasn't made anywhere near the same amount of title defenses as the likes of Muhammad Ali. He's not even near that conversation. And so if you're talking about at least defending against the kings of this era, well then who are you talking about? You're talking about guys that were world champions. Guys like Joseph Parker, Andy Ruiz, Anthony Joshua. He's not fought any of those guys. However, remember we're playing defense and prosecution here. I'm trying to give you both sides of an argument and think critically on both sides. Doesn't mean you have to give equal value to each argument, but you have to understand the strong points and the weak points of each argument when you're trying to analyze something. And so let me jump back into the role of the lawyer of Antonio Tarver or Tyson Fury, who would say that we don't need the likes of Anthony Joshua, Joseph Parker, Andy Ruiz, or anybody else if we go and beat Alexander Usyk. And then I'll jump back into the role of the prosecutor and explain why, despite this argument, Tyson Fury should still fight Anthony Joshua. So, from the Fury perspective, there are more belts around today than there ever were. So you could make the argument that it's actually easier to pick up a belt these days than it would have been back then. He would argue, Fury, of the possible opponents that I could fight today, the ones that would have been good enough to win a world title if there were only 2 belts like in the era of Ali, I've fought already. Those that I haven't fought wouldn't have been anything more than contenders. I don't need to fight the likes of Andy Ruiz and Joseph Parker because all those guys that picked up belts but fell by the wayside, they're no better than the likes of Dwayne Bobbick and Tad Spencer that Muhammad Ali didn't fight. And like I said, there's a caveat as to why I wouldn't agree with this argument as a justification to not fight Anthony Joshua, and we'll get to that in a moment, but let's roll with this for a second. Dwayne Bobbick had been a top contender for numerous years there, and if you look at his record, 52 fights, 48 wins, 42 of them by way of knockout. This is a guy that fought a lot of the contenders like Scott Ledoux, Chuck Webner, Randy Newman, Manuel Ramos, and he also beat Mike Weaver, who would go on to become a heavyweight champion. He also beat Larry Holmes in the amateurs in an Olympic trial. And Muhammad Ali was actually the commentator on national TV for this fight. And he said there aren't that many great white heavyweights, but this guy's one of them. These are the 2 best amateur heavyweights in the country. And that the guy that goes on to win this tournament will tend to go on to become the Olympic gold medalist and the best amateur in the world. And one day he might have to challenge Bobbick if Bobbick is to beat Larry Holmes. Well, he dropped him, he beat him, because Holmes was disqualified for excessive holding after being hurt. In fact, on top of all that, Bobbick even has a win over the great Teofilo Stevenson, who is widely considered by many to be the greatest amateur heavyweight of all time, a 3-time Olympic gold medalist, and many wonder if the Cuban was able to turn pro, whether he would have actually come out on top in a rivalry against Muhammad Ali. Well, Bobbick has a victory of him in the Pan American Games where he went on to win a gold medal. So he was a serious guy at amateur and pro. And there were actually negotiations in 1976 for Ali to fight Bobbick. It would never come about. Ali announced his temporary retirement from boxing. Bobbick then went on to fight Ken Norton, and he actually got stopped by Ken Norton in 1 round. So you could argue that Muhammad Ali may have gone on to fight Bobbick if he hadn't lost to Ken Norton. However, the flip side to that argument is to say, well, if you're not going to inherit somebody else's CV, then why does that matter? After all, Muhammad Ali was also accused of getting a gift decision against the same fighter, Ken Norton, a few months earlier. The UPI had Norton winning the fight. The Milwaukee Sentinel described it as Ali plain lucky to win a decision. The Associated Press described it as debate may rage infinitely, and Ken Norton outlanded Muhammad Ali in the fight by 286 punches to 199. He also outlanded him in power punches by 192 to 128. In fact, in 1998, the January edition of the Boxing Monthly listed Ali Norton III as the fifth most disputed title fight decision in history. So if losing to Usyk twice doesn't relegate Anthony Joshua out of the run-in to fight Fury, why would losing to Norton have eliminated Bobbick from the run-in to fight Ali? And yet, that fight never came to pass. You see this sort of thing as well in the 60s era. Thad Spencer also fought top guys like Doug Jones, Brian London, Top McNeely, George Johnson, Lincoln. And he was so highly rated that when the WBA had a super series type of tournament after Ali's enforced hiatus, and they had this 8-man tournament to see who would become the legitimate champion, Thad Spencer entered it. And he beat Ernie Terrell, who was a former world champion. So he got to the semi-finals. He ended up losing to Quarry in what was a bit of a shock. He was actually the favourite. Now, just to clarify, although he hadn't fought Thad Spencer, he had been fighting other top contenders during that time. So no one's accusing him of looking for soft touches or ducking anybody. Muhammad Ali just wasn't that type of guy. And as for Bobbick, I don't think he had the chin to have been able to have beaten Muhammad Ali. So nobody's accusing him of anything here. I'm just trying to explain that the logistics of boxing means that even if you are somebody like Ali who wants to fight everybody, it's not always possible to be able to fight all of the contenders of the day. And as a result, whichever way you cut it, the fact remains he was a top-level fighter, and Muhammad Ali didn't fight him. And had there been 4 belts in the era, guys like Thad Spencer, guys like Dwayne Bobbick may very well have picked up a world title. And so the Fury camp claim could be that just like Muhammad Ali, Tyson Fury fought the genuinely best fighters in his day, and the lesser champions that he did not fight would not have been world champions in Muhammad Ali's era either, just like Bobbick and Spencer. So it's not necessary to fight them, just like it wasn't necessary for Ali to fight those contenders because he beat better guys than them. Now, even if we were to concede that point, I don't think you can extend that to Anthony Joshua, can you? Joshua is an Olympic gold medalist, a former unified heavyweight champion. He's one of the kings of the era. So here's the thing. Whilst I agree that from a sporting perspective, Tyson Fury would have conquered, it would be known as the Fury era. And at the end of the day, if you were the king of your era, you will always be in the conversation as an all-time great. You know you've got the Jack Johnson era, the Marciano era, the Ali era, the Larry Holmes era, and so on and so forth. It would be the Tyson Fury era. But ask yourself this. Wouldn't it be fair to say that it's the public that metaphorically lift the fighter on their shoulders so that his reputation reverberates through the annals of time? It's the way the public perceives you that gives you a legendary status. Which leads us on to the pertinent question. What is a legendary man, and how is his legend established? It's more than just demonstrable achievement and trinkets, but rather it is the story that is cherished through the ages. In order to be passed from generation to generation, those stories must resonate with the public. And it is those stories that lead to wide-eyed, slack-jawed children watching their favourite fighters in awe. A real-life fairy tale in motion on the silver screen. Lying on their beds at night, staring at their hero's poster, dreaming of emulating him one day. And among those kids are the champions of the future, and they are driven by that story. It is those stories of glory and riches that motivate those in poverty-stricken nations to first wrap their hands. It is those stories that stimulate a fighter to bite down on that gum shield when they have lost the taste for battle, to embrace the glory that perseverance promises. And whilst Fury has already presented us with some timeless stories, perhaps there is no greater story in the heavyweight division than Fury versus Joshua. Two names that have become synonymous with each other. Two British titans of the sport, drawing an adoring public. Two superheroes ready to prove they possess the other's kryptonite. In various old libraries around the world, there are beautifully written novels, adored by dedicated librarians, and yet the majority of the public will never read their paragraphs. But those novels that endure are those that are valued by a great amount of people through the generations. Even if Fury's display against Usyk is a masterclass, along the lines of his displays against Klitschko and Wilder, even if it is a perfectly conducted symphony or the consummate sonnet expressed by a master poet, the fact will remain of all the possible boxing arts that could be created, Fury versus Joshua would still be the biggest seller. That's why it's a fight that needs to happen. Fury might conquer the world without needing AJ's scalp, but the Tyson Fury story thirsts for that fight. Now, obviously, lest we forget, there's a menace that stands in the path of Fury, a predator that is writing his own story. But let me know what you think. If Fury is to overcome the man that dominated Joshua to become undisputed, would he still need AJ's scalp? Or do you agree with the great of yesteryear and Antonio Tarver that beating Usyk and becoming undisputed would be enough for mission to be accomplished? Let me know in the comment section down below. Please don't forget to hit a stiff jab on the like button, a right cross on the subscribe button, and an uppercut on the notifications button. Thanks for watching. Chat to you soon. Take care. God bless.